collab- collaborating internally. Over the next hour, we're going to have a really memorable experience. We're going to be joined by our great partner, friend, and leader, Dayton Ogden, and an incredibly special guest, Dan Cnossen. Everybody knows about Dayton's iconic career here as a leader at Spencer Stuart, but maybe some of you don't know that in addition to Dayton's Spencer Stuart career, he had a distinguished U.S. naval career as well. He was a gunner officer on a U.S. Navy destroyer, and following that, he was in charge of a swift boat in the Vietnam War on the Mekong Delta. And it's the latter part of this background that allows Dayton to be perfectly suited for this discussion, which is something, again, we're really excited about. Thanks very much to our great friend and partner, Lauren Callahan from the New York office, who introduced us to Dan. Dan Cnossen is someone who we're going to get to know here, and we've gotten to know him over the last few weeks. Dan is a former Navy SEAL, and that alone is incredible. But he overcame life-altering injuries in combat, not just to recover, but to persevere and ultimately thrive. Dan is a two-time Paralympian from the Paralympic Games in 2014 and 2018, and he's a six-time medalist. Through this conversation with Dayton, Dan's going to talk about some of the things that are really important to him and how he's overcome adversity and really inspire us, and through us, our clients, our candidates, and the world at large. So Dan was wounded in Afghanistan when he tragically stepped on an IED, but he led a remarkable road to recovery, immersing himself in a regimen required to become a Paralympian athlete. And in so doing, he has really learned life lessons about resilience, recovery, renewal, and leadership. What we'll do in this hour, in a couple of minutes, in a moment rather, I'll turn it over to Dayton, and Dayton and Dan are going to have a little bit of a fireside chat. Over the course of this, we'll also have the moderator. We'll have the ability to use the chat feature here to do questions, and we'll have time for plenty of Q&A with Dan. And then when we close, Dan's going to say a few final remarks. I just want to make one kind of commercial plea for us to think about with regard to Dan. Dan is in addition to everything else, he is a professional speaker, and he is doing this with us as a friend and relationship building. But we want to be inspired, but also we have the opportunity to take Dan's message to our clients, our friends out there. So I want you to keep that in mind as well. But for right now, let me turn it over to you, Dave, to have this great chat with Dan. And please feel free, everybody, to pump in questions into the chat feature. So here we go.
Jim, thanks so much for setting the stage today. It's great to have so many colleagues joining us. Sorry about that. I've had a chance to get to know Dan a bit prior to this prior to this discussion, and as someone who served in the military, as Jim suggested many years ago, it's really hard for me to comprehend what Dan has overcome, and I feel really inspired by what Dan has accomplished as a veteran, as a world-class athlete, and as a true leader. And with that, and in the interest of time, I will begin with the first question. Dan, something that has perplexed me from the time we started chatting together is that how does someone who has a fear of heights and a fear of water overcome these kinds of obstacles to become a Navy SEAL? And if you could also address whether there are fundamental steps that leaders can take to overcome these fears?
Thanks, Dayton. First, I would say it's been great working with you, getting to know you, especially given our mutual heritage in the Navy. Jim, I appreciate what you and everyone at Spencer Stuart has done to give me this opportunity. And for those of you who are tuning in and listening, I really appreciate you giving your time out of your busy schedule to hear me talk. So I, by way of background, grew up in Kansas. I was raised on a fifth-generation farm. I knew in high school that I wanted to combine military service with going to college. I applied to what made sense to me, West Point for the Army, to go to one of the service academies, and to the U.S. Naval Academy for the Navy and Marine Corps. And in my senior year in high school, I found out that I had been accepted into the best one, the U.S. Naval Academy. That's where I went after graduating high school, to be a Marine Corps infantry officer. But by the end of my first year, I took a good look around at my circle of friends, the people who I naturally was drawn to based on common interest and personality. And, well, they all wanted to be selected for the SEAL program when we would graduate 4 years down the road. And like a good leader, I ended up following my friends and doing what they wanted to do, which is desiring to be selected for the SEAL program. A couple of these guys were All-American swimmers in high school, now varsity swimmers as freshmen at the Naval Academy. A couple were really talented boxers, and I know that because I tried sparring them and I found out the hard way. And then there was, I was harboring a secret. This secret was, as Dayton alluded to, I was afraid of the water, which is a problem for anyone who goes to the U.S. Naval Academy. It really is a problem if you go to the U.S. Naval Academy and you want to be selected for one of the highly competitive billets to go to SEAL training. Needless to say, in addition to needing to work on my career decision-making skills, I needed to get in the water. And that's what I did for the better part of 4 years. Getting in the water every day, working on my stroke, working on breath holding, working on drown proofing, working on my stroke to try to get faster. By the time I did get into SEAL training, by the time it was getting closer to the end, we were doing more highly advanced activities like rappelling and skydiving and airborne operations. I came to find out that I had a distinct fear of jumping out of planes as well. For those of you who don't know, SEAL stands for sea, air, and land. And when you are uncomfortable in the water and the air, trust me, you really like it. Training centers on the land-based stuff. But I think this swimming and fear of water episode in my life is a very good metaphor for leaders. You know, you're standing at the edge of this pool deck. This field of leadership is in front of you, so to speak. The water is deep. You might drown. It's scary sometimes, but you just got to take the step, take the plunge, immerse yourself, do what you can do day by day, work on your stroke, work on your breath holding, do what it takes. This source of fear that I had, the fear of the water, eventually became a source of strength when I got into SEAL training, because I had been conditioned for years to be uncomfortable in the water. And in SEAL training, it pushes you to the limits. And so I was used to being uncomfortable in the water. That source of strength then became a source of passion, as I now am just thoroughly addicted to surfing and to being in the water. And that's, I think, the evolution of leadership. Source of fear can become a source of and a source of passion. And that's when performance can really accelerate.
Great answer. Do you have any sort of magic formula for how leaders can overcome their fears?
I think you have to start small in bite-sized pieces. It's like learning how to swim. You got to take the plunge. You got to immerse yourself and do little things day by day. And we'll get into later in this discussion. I'm sure we'll get into some of my leadership principles. But that is the crawl, walk, run approach that. Oh, by the way, SEAL platoons go through in an 18-month workup cycle. I think we'll get into later on in the discussion as well.
Great. Another question, Dan. About 50 years ago, I had a chance to work with some of your elder brethren, and I was always just overwhelmed by their commitment, their discipline, and the way they went about confronting the uncertainties that face them. And I always said to myself, those guys must have been trained different than the rest of us. So could you talk to us a little bit about your SEAL training?
Sure. For those who aren't familiar, basic SEAL training is called BUDS, basic underwater demolition SEAL. It lasts about 6 or 7 months. It is then followed on by many more months of more advanced level training to become a certified, qualified Navy SEAL. BUDS is the very miserable phase, 6, 7 months, as I said, highlighted by a very, very difficult week that actually happens pretty early on in the process. It's called Hell Week, and it happens around the 4th or 5th week, depending on the calendar. Hell Week starts on a Sunday and it ends on a Friday, as do most work weeks. But this is a particularly intense one because you do not sleep once. You don't sleep once until Wednesday. So here we are. Today is Friday. I can hardly even think back to what I was doing on Sunday. And that's not just a quarantine level phenomenon. I mean, Hell Week is a very, very long week. You don't sleep once until Wednesday. And that first sleep break is about 45 minutes to wake you from this deep, deep sleep. The SEAL instructors will shoot machine guns nearby. It's just blanks, not real bullets, but to wake you from this deep sleep, you must immediately get right back into training. You can't hit the snooze button or they'll kick you out. And that first sleep break is followed by 3, 4 more sleep breaks between Wednesday and the conclusion of Hell Week on Friday. It's just enough sleep to keep you from getting brain damage. So you are absolutely pushed to your physical and mental limits. You're brought to the brink of hypothermia in numerous surf torture sessions where you're tempted to quit by this blazing fire nearby on the beach. If you just quit, you can go warm up, you can sleep. Wondering, and 80% of the people quit or they're dropped or they're injured in this week. So it was very daunting for me. And I showed up as a junior officer fresh out of the Naval Academy. Hell Week starts, and I'll tell you a little story from early on in Hell Week. It was Sunday night, and just a few hours in, it's probably 1 a.m. at this point, and we're starting the second evolution or the second major race of Hell Week. Everything is a race. It's one boat crew, which is a 7-man team against every other boat crew in the class. And you really want to win or do well in these races because the boat crews that finish towards the back really get punished. And around the time the punishment ends, the next race begins. The teams who did well are a little more fresh. So it's a cascading effect. My team lined up for the next evolution, this next race, and we received a telephone pole. Not uncommon. In BUDS, you do a lot of work with telephone poles. These are sectioned off telephone poles that are long enough for 7 men to carry them. We received our log from the bed of a pickup truck and immediately groaned under the weight of this thing. Everything done in Hell Week, you've done in the weeks leading up to Hell Week. It's just now it's sleep deprivation. It's more pressure, more stress. But I knew what a typical log was supposed to weigh. Something about this behemoth of a log that my team so unfortunately and arbitrarily drew from the bed of this pickup truck must have weighed 2, if not maybe 3 times more than anything I carried into training up to this point. I quickly started thinking, what is going on with this thing? Did it fall in the ocean? Is it waterlogged? No pun intended there. Did the instructors put concrete in the middle and seal it back up? I didn't know, but yet we have to race the other teams in the class. This is so unfair. I took a quick look around. The other boat crews didn't have logs even closely approximating the weight of this one, and yet we have to race them. So unfair. 10 minutes into the race, and we have no idea when this race is going to end. Things were not going well for my boat crew. We were in dead last place. Couldn't even see the second to last place team in front of us on this beach horizon. We're going through soft sand. I'm the junior officer and the leader of this boat crew. I should say there are 2 positions under a log that are commonly acknowledged to be the most painful. One is at the far right end, and the other is the far left end. As the junior officer and the leader of this team, I wanted to demonstrate to my teammates, and let's be honest, to the SEAL instructors who are evaluating me on my leadership, that I was willing to step into one of those 2 positions, to lead from the front, so to speak, to carry my share of the weight. But 10 minutes into the race, things really weren't going well for me personally. It was more physical pain than I'd ever been in my life because the person next to me, his arms had pretty much just given out. And you really notice the addition of weight when something like that happens. And the whole team can just fall apart, tension and tempers flare. When you're in last place in Hell Week, you are like a magnet for the SEAL instructors. They descended upon me like sharks, speaking into their megaphones, putting it on, get it together, sir, start leading your men. We're going to drop you from training. I let it get to my head. the frustration of the situation, because I couldn't speak back. I couldn't say, can't you see that this log is so heavy? Really compounded the physical pain. And then I started thinking long-term thoughts. How am I going to get through this log race? How am I going to make it through tonight? How am I going to get to Wednesday? How am I going to make it to Friday? It's impossibly far away. It started weighing me down, and I really was at my breaking point. I started with the last few remaining ounces of strength that I had to play this little game where I'd be free to quit. At first, I must take a step through the soft sand. I'd take a step, not quite ready to quit. Let's take another step. I'd be free to quit, but I started taking a step and a step and a step, not ready to step out and quit, to do that to my teammates. They really got in my face, the instructors did. I decided to start yelling out some encouragement to the team. Come on, guys, let's go, let's go, let's go. It projected my pain and my frustration outward, but more importantly, it was this game I was playing. Just take a step, you're free to quit. You have control of the situation. Just take another step, take another step. Eventually the race ended. We got in dead last place. We got hammered by the instructors like I knew we would. But for the rest of Hell Week, I can honestly say I didn't have the most infinitesimal thought of quitting. That little thought from which further thoughts could germinate and eventually take over your head. I learned a very valuable lesson. The best way to block out the long-term thoughts of the future, which can only be discouraging in the moment, to focus on the task at hand. In this case, literally the log in my arms. Focus on what you actually need to do. And in that log race, there were only two things I needed to do. Number one, support the log to the best of my ability with my arms. Number two, advance it forward through the soft sand with my teammates one step at a time. That's it, just those two things. Thoughts of when is this race going to end? Thoughts of Wednesday or Friday, they were irrelevant to the task at hand. Just those two things, one step at a time, one more step.
Wonderful story, Dan. And as just a follow on, there's something that I've thought about many times over the years, both in the military, but even more acutely at Spencer Stuart, and that is whether leaders are born or whether they can be made or developed. And I just wonder, in your experience, did being a leader come naturally to you, or was this something that was really created during your very grueling SEAL training?
Well, this is a good question. I think there are many facets of successful leadership, and I would be really surprised if someone was naturally endowed with all of these aspects and facets. Right. I think some things have come easier to me than others, and other things I really had to work on. A couple of things that came a bit more naturally to me include leading by example, which may be dismissed in some leadership circles as the kind of obvious thing. I can say with certitude, it is very, very important to lead by example. As a junior officer in the SEAL teams, if I didn't have my basic SEAL shooter skills dialed in, my fitness dialed in, that's the benchmark by which the enlisted members of the platoon are going to judge me. Even though my main responsibility as the platoon commander is to do mission planning and mission execution, if I don't have the basic SEAL fundamental skills dialed in, they will absolutely judge me. And I think leading by example is certainly worth highlighting. It is certainly worth emphasizing and focusing on. I happen to be optimistic. I happen to have a challenge-oriented mindset and to be about challenges. And I think this is important as a leader. Now, some of the things I had to work on include getting up in front of a group and leading through words. I remember being nervous talking in front of the platoon sometimes. Like, these are, in many cases, people who are 10, 15 years older than me. They have that much more experience in the SEAL team. All I have done is a officer commissioning program. No one cares. I've done Hell Week. No one cares. When you get to a SEAL team, everyone has done Hell Week. No one cares.
Everybody's done it, yeah.
And so that made me nervous. I had to really rehearse before I would get up before a platoon mission planning or mission brief on a deployment or training exercise. I also struggled, I think, early on in my career with wanting to be liked by the enlisted members of the platoon.
Right.
Instead of focusing on being a leader and realizing that sometimes leaders have to make hard and often unpopular decisions. And this is something that I think many junior leaders and managers can struggle with. I was no different. It's something I think that I could have done better at.
Has your perspective, Dan, changed as a result as you've gone along post your SEAL career as a result of your experiences, or is it pretty much rooted in that original experience?
That's a good question. I think there was an evolution. I think in my leadership, I think when I was a brand new junior officer, as I alluded to earlier, when you get to a SEAL team, you're out of basic SEAL training now. Now you've shown up at a SEAL team. There were members of the team, some of whom were in their 30s or 40s, and they have a vast amount more experience in the SEAL teams than I had. But yet I technically outranked them as an officer.
Yeah.
And I wanted to show that I have my stuff together, and I think they can see right through that. So I would say this: not knowing is actually a position of strength. And what do I mean by that? Well, when I became a platoon commander several years later, at this point, I wasn't a platoon commander until 6-7 years into my career, I realized that not knowing is a position of strength because it gives me the chance to enable and empower the members of the platoon. As the platoon commander, I am managing a cohort of experts. Some have been to sniper school. That's months long. I don't have that experience as an officer. I'm a general manager, a generalist. Snipers, breachers, communicators, medics. And if I'm planning an operation, which is my main job, and to be a ground force commander, it absolutely makes sense to ask the opinion of the members of the platoon. It is not weakness not to know something. It is actually a chance to empower the members of the platoon to create buy-in, and ultimately it garners more respect. So that is the number one evolution that I think I had in my years in the SEAL teams, is realizing that not knowing is actually a position of strength.
Right. That's a great answer. I remember the only, yes, Jim.
I just want to underscore for all of us what Dan just said. That's an unbelievably powerful
great answer
point that is so translatable to our leadership advisory work in the world, that know-it-alls, even the smartest person in the room, is a position of weakness. And to do that, the benefits, both in terms of getting better answers and the buy-in. So thank you, Dan. It was a brilliant comment.
Great. Fantastic. Dan, I just while we're switching back our technology, I just, my major leadership contribution in Vietnam was that I never let a Navy SEAL or a helicopter Seawolf pilot buy their own drink, because nobody helped us more than those two categories of people. So that was my major leadership lesson. So, Jim, you're still. So let's go to the Afghanistan experience. Jim, I've got you on the
screen.
Anyway, Dan, let's talk about that fateful night when you were on the Afghanistan, the mission in Afghanistan to recover a Russian fort. Could you explain a little bit about that experience and how extraordinary it was and how difficult it was?
Sure. At this point in my career, I'm a platoon commander. It's 2008. We went through an 18-month workup into 2009, where I was going through all the blocks of training with my platoon that a SEAL platoon must go through to be ready to deploy. We did well during this phase of training and assessment, and were selected to go on a high-risk deployment to Afghanistan, where we would be conducting operations against Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And so as a key leader, as the platoon commander, it was important for me to get on the ground in Afghanistan in advance of the rest of the platoon, so that I could link up with the SEAL platoon that we would be replacing, which was working with one other SEAL platoon, and see how they were planning and conducting operations, so that by the time the rest of my platoon arrived a few weeks down the road, I would be dialed in as a leader, and they could then flow into their operations. This is this concept of servant leadership, which I can talk about.
Great.
I got on the ground and the two SEAL platoons pretty quickly thereafter. Now, keeping in mind, my platoon is not here yet. Those two SEAL platoons were going to be going on a nighttime assault mission, going after a Taliban compound in deep in Taliban-controlled territory. I would be there in a non-leadership role, but certainly fundamentally as an observer and as a shooter, as a basic SEAL shooter. So the mission was to take the helicopters out of Kandahar airfield, and this 40-person assault force would conduct a target assault. I was part of a 10-man element that was assigned to detach from the main assault force. We would hike up to the top of a large hill that overlooked that Taliban compound down below. We knew from satellite imagery that there was a old Soviet fort from back in the days when the Russians occupied Afghanistan. We needed to own the high ground, so to speak, make sure no one or nothing was up there that would impede with that assault, and that owning the high ground is a tactical advantage in a military operation like this. So when we had completed our mini objective, we would radio down to the main assault force, which would then conduct a target assault prior to first light. So we launched our assault as per the mission plan. The 10-man element that I was a part of detached from the main assault force. We hiked up to the top of this hill, the old Soviet fort. We're all on night vision goggles, as some of you may have seen on the pre slides. And this old Soviet fort is looking like it's from medieval times. And it was about a 15-minute hike to the top of this hill. We fanned out. We had a Navy explosive ordnance disposal technician with us who's trained to detect and defeat bombs. But we didn't know if anybody was up there. So we're going forward with our rifles. And all of a sudden, from beneath my night vision goggles, just a flash of light, and I'm on the ground. I didn't realize what had happened. And then I'm coming to, I'm foggy, disoriented, realizing I must have stepped on an IED, a pressure plate. IEDs are improvised explosive devices. They're buried underground. The pressure plate, with the weight of a human or an object up above, connects the two plates underground, and the bomb goes off. In this case, the bomb was actually two 105 millimeter artillery shells wired together, both intended to go off. Taken together, it could have destroyed an armored vehicle, but the second artillery shell didn't explode, and the first one went off low order, meaning not all of the explosive powder detonated. We didn't realize that at the time. I'm laying on the ground wondering, are my teammates okay? I need them to be okay. I hope they are okay. Everything was dark. My night vision goggles had been blasted off. Couldn't really move. My arms seemed to work. I realized I need to get out, man down over the radio. That would then key in the ground force commander, who was down below with the main assault force, that there's an injured SEAL. So I reached up to my push to talk, which keys up the radio, but it wasn't there. In fact, nothing on my kit was where my hands knew things should be based on years of doing this. For a second, I was just utterly helpless. And then my teammates descended upon me. None of them were injured in the blast. They started assessing the situation. The SEAL medic started applying tourniquets. I hadn't been in pain from the blast, but the application of those tourniquets was excruciating. He ended up applying 6 tourniquets, 3 to each limb, to try to cut off the blood flow. Time, meanwhile, is of the essence, because the helicopters that had dropped us off had gone back to Kandahar airfield, loaded on several Army Green Beret soldiers and Afghan commando soldiers. They were bringing them back to be a blocking force for when this target assault commenced. So there was already 2 helicopters airborne en route heading towards us, but time is going to be of the essence. So the SEAL ground force commander made the decision. The helicopters are not going to land or hover on this hill. It's too dangerous. Don't know what's up there. More bombs could go off. So some of the SEALs down below with the main assault force were assigned to detach and go clear a suitably flat helicopter landing zone. My teammates up above with me were ordered to get me down off that hill ASAP. They started trying to carry me down, but it was too deep, too rocky, and too dark, and we just kept falling. So they went to the last resort, which is a body drag, and we do this in training, where you're grabbing the injured person, in this case me. I'm in the supine position by my kit, the shoulder straps on my kit, and doing about 30-second bursts. It's very fatiguing for the person doing the dragging, so they were rotating out. Corey, the SEAL medic, was staying beside me, telling me to stay awake, stay awake. I was hanging on to his words. I remember time not really having any sort of flow to it, that there was no real thought in my mind of not making it through this situation or not seeing my family again. Those thoughts just weren't there. I was consumed by this world of pain, because every craggy rock was cutting into my body like sharp knives. The pain was was so much. It was all I could do, just try to stay awake and hang on to Corey's words telling me to just keep breathing, stay awake, stay awake. And that's what I did. The drag seemed to last forever, but it was probably about 20, 25 minutes to get down off this craggy, rocky mountain in Afghanistan. And me, the helicopter was getting precariously low on fuel. They got me onto the helicopter within 1 minute of the helicopter reaching bingo fuel. That's the point at which it must return to point of origin or it will drop out of the sky. Within 1 minute of that point, they got me on board the helicopter. There was a light in my face from the flight surgeon on board, and then it was just darkness and emptiness. I was out cold.
Hard to comprehend. It's unbelievable. Dan, following your injury, they put you in a medically induced coma for roughly a week and got you back here to the States. What was that like, waking up in the hospital for the first time?
Correct. I was in a medically induced coma. I had been loaded onto that helicopter, and I went through round after round of surgery, but these days are a black hole to me. It ended up being 10 days, and I wake up in a hospital room. My last memories are of this night in Afghanistan, and my mom's face is about a foot away.
Wow.
What happened? She had been alerted out of the blue what had happened to me, a phone call. Imagine what she was going through. She wasn't sleeping very well. The day that I was going to be lifted from this induced coma, she was down at the Dunkin' Donuts in the basement of Bethesda Naval Hospital. And she gets a call from my sister telling her to get up, that I'm going to be coming out of this induced coma pretty soon. And so she kits up in the ICU room, and there she is. And I remember commenting on the coffee breath hitting me full force in the ICU room, because I am not a coffee drinker, and I really don't like coffee breath. And this is a joke with our family, but I remember early on asking the medical professional by the right of my bed whether my legs were gone, because I wasn't looking down that direction and no one was telling me anything. I remember that person saying yes. Yeah. I gotta say, that is a tough thing to hear all of a sudden that your legs are gone, and it's a tough thing to process. In addition to that, I had a shattered pelvis. It was held in place by an external fixator, drilled into the bone. It wouldn't let me rotate onto my side or stomach, my preferred sleeping positions. This would be in place for 100 days. I had a colostomy bag. I didn't have any idea what that was, but I came to find out that is generally something people don't desire to have. I had a bladder, ruptured bladder, that was a tube coming out of my bladder that was connected to a bag. My urethra had been severed. I was tube intubated. I had an NG tube. I woke up from this coma with an NG tube up my nose, down my throat, into my stomach to decompress things. This meant that I wasn't allowed to eat or drink anything for as long as this NG tube would be in place, and they couldn't tell me for how long it would be in place. No food, no water, hydrated by IV, fed by IV. As much as I love to eat, the fact that I couldn't eat was my biggest problem. It was actually this NG tube. I wanted to rip the thing out, but I couldn't do it. They'd have to put it right back in. And I was going through surgeries week after week after week. And I had nightmares verging on delirium, adverse mental reaction to the painkillers. This was my ground zero. Unlike under that log where at any given moment, I could have quit. Granted, I was pushed to my physical limits, but I could have ended it. But here in this ICU room now, I am in this. I started thinking, how unlucky was I for this to happen? I'll never have the chance to put my leadership and training and skills to the test as a platoon commander, because my platoon wasn't even on the ground yet. They weren't even in Afghanistan.
Right.
My identity was wrapped up in being a SEAL, and it was gone just like that overnight. Where am I going to go from here? What am I going to do? How am I going to find meaning and satisfaction and fulfillment now that I can no longer do this job in the way that I had been doing it, the way that I wanted to keep doing it? What is the rest of my life going to look like? How am I going to live? Am I going to walk? Am I going to be in a wheelchair? I don't know. I don't know what it's going to look like. Ultimately, though, I fell back on what I learned under that telephone pole log, which is the best way to block out the long-term thoughts of the future, which can only be discouraging in that moment, is to focus on the task at hand, to prioritize and rigorously focus on what you actually need to do in that moment. And In the early days in the ICU, it was all I could do to get through the next 5 minutes, sometimes through the next minute. That is not to say I didn't have long-term goals. I absolutely did. They weren't anything grandiose. They included getting out of this hospital, walking, running. But these goals were too long-term, too distant, far away. I couldn't think about them at any stretch of time because to do so would only result in discouragement. So my mindset in the beginning was do what it takes to get through today to make it to tomorrow and focus on tomorrow when you get there. And I should add, the other thing that I did learn something about was perspective. Although losing your legs is very difficult, I started to realize pretty quickly in that hospital environment that I am incredibly lucky to have my vision, my hearing, that I can think clearly. Some might debate that, but I mean, in my own opinion, I can think clearly. And as problematic as thinking can be, it is really, given all the blood that I lost and the concussive effects of that blast, it is very fortunate that I can think clearly. I have my arms. I was laying in bed thinking, losing 2 legs is a chance to stand over 6 feet tall. These little jokes that I had, they helped me with humor get through the situation. And
you are a case study in grit, and you've already covered a lot of this in our discussion, but I want to make sure that we get kind of your leadership principles and the experiences that underpin them, so that our colleagues, because we've got to try to help our clients deal with extraordinary uncertainty just as a result of what's happened in the last 3 months. So it'd be great to get your sort of main principles of leadership.
Absolutely. Yes, we are all dealing with a lot of uncertainty during this time. I would say the fundamental premise that when I think about leadership, the concept that undergirds all of it, from which all of other principles emanate, is this concept of servant leadership. It means the leader is there to empower the team. Instead of thinking, how can I lead my team? It is rather, how can I enable our team? This is fundamentally servant leadership. Ego, hubris, that gets checked at the door. It is all about empowering the team. I also really want to emphasize contingency planning. In the SEAL teams as a junior officer, it was hammered home. When you are planning an operation, which is my primary role and responsibility, to do contingency planning, we would break an operation into 5 phases. Of course, there's the focus on the actions at the objective, the target, but how are you getting there? And so there's the insertion phase. Are you taking a helicopter? Are you taking a boat? Are you taking a vehicle? How are you getting from that platform to the target? Let's say foot patrolling, but what's the route you're going to take? Actions at the exfiltration, how are you getting out of the target? And extraction, what platform is picking you up? For every phase of the operation, I would definitely spend time planning the way you think and want things to happen, but I would absolutely spend time brainstorming 2 to 3 likely contingencies that could happen. What if the vehicle breaks down? Well, we need enough open seats on the remaining vehicles to cross-load. What if we're contacted by the enemy en route to the target? What do we do? Do we press ahead? Do we break contact? What if the person we're looking for on target isn't there? Do we flex? Do we call it and go home? What if the helicopters that are coming to pick you up are late? All of these contingencies, whether they happen as planned or not, the fact of the matter is no mission ever goes fundamentally according to plan. You can absolutely achieve the objective, but things will always go wrong. And the act of contingency planning really equips the leader in the field, in the moment, to respond to situations, even if they are different than what was planned out for contingency. So I think that is very important. And within that concept, there is succession planning. It was, I think, in my case, fundamentally important, given the fact that I was injured so early on deployment, to train my subordinates do my job. And we went through an 18-month workup where we were put through all of the blocks of training. It was my first time being a platoon commander. It wasn't easy for me to step aside and to let my assistant platoon commander take over. But given what happened to me on deployment, before the rest of the platoon even arrived, he was told he was going to have to take over my position. He was a brand new SEAL officer, had never deployed, and by all accounts, he did very, very well. It is fundamentally important to do succession planning, not just for the C-suite, but for at all levels. You typically understand how, at least in the military, one rung below you, because you've come from that position, but you often do not necessarily understand the roles and responsibilities of one position above you. So it's very important to give subordinates that opportunity so that they're ready to step in the event that there's an emergency. I also think it's important as a leader to create a culture where debriefing, rigorous and critical debriefing, is encouraged. And this is a tough thing to develop, but it's very important for bringing the organization forward. Last but not least, there is this saying in the SEAL teams: always improve your fighting position. What do I mean by that? Well, I think there are two scenarios that can tend to overwhelm leaders. One is being overwhelmed by a myriad of options. The other is being overwhelmed by a dearth of options. So for the first case, overwhelmed by a myriad of options, there are so many potential courses of action, you are almost paralyzed. Well, if you can remember this, always improve your fighting position. We'll pick the number one thing that will improve your fighting position. Focus on that. Everything else is ancillary. Second scenario, being overwhelmed by a dearth of options. Everything seems like it's not really going to do anything. You're about to be overrun. Hope is almost lost. What can you do? Well, I hark back to the story that I told of how I was injured. And I was laying there on that mountain after the blast, wondering whether my teammates are okay, not knowing, realizing that I can't even move. For a second there, I remember feeling utterly helpless. Couldn't do anything. But then training kicked in. There was one thing I could do. I could reach for my push to talk. I could try to key out over the radio, man down. That would then spin up the ground force commander. Always improve your fighting position. As a leader, you are never out of the fight. You and your team are never out of the fight. You can always do something to improve your fighting position.
Great. Great answer. In a minute, I'm going to turn it over to Jim to preside over a little Q&A. I just want to get you to talk to our colleagues from all over North America a little bit about the whole concept of uncertainty and managing through uncertainty. You've already alluded to many of the techniques that you have found underpin your approach, but uncertainty is a critical notion, particularly in today's times.
Yes, it is. I think when I talk about how to react in uncertain times, it is focusing on how you can respond. Which is really all that you can control, is how you can respond. To realize that, yes, you can improve your fighting position. Yes, there are steps you can take. And focus on one thing, prioritize, and then execute. And really, really keeping that in mind to the exclusion of all the extraneous things that are going on is fundamentally important in time of crisis.
Great answer. Dan, this has been such a tremendous honor and pleasure. Great discussion. Thanks so much. Very meaningful. Jim is now going to cover a few of the questions that have emerged from our colleagues. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Dave. Dan, so the chat box is lighting up with all sorts of wonderful feedback and great stuff. A couple of questions. So Michelle Richardson is asking, did you ever lose hope? And if so, how did you persevere?
Thank you for that question. When I was laying in the ICU room, there were absolutely times that I was down. I was thinking, like, how unlucky was I to step where I did in time and space for this bomb to go off? Think of all the variables that had to line up for this to happen, and yet it did. How unlucky is that? But with perspective, I now realize that the exact same situation, just viewed from a different angle, which is what perspective is all really about, just viewing something from a different angle. There's the other side of the coin, which is given the fact that I did step where I did in time and space, given the fact that I wasn't vaporized instantaneously, the fact that that second artillery shell didn't explode, that the first one went off low order, given the fact that none of my teammates were injured in the blast, given the fact that the helicopters were already airborne en route that much closer to me, and that my teammates got me on the helicopter within 1 minute of it reaching bingo fuel, all of these facts line up and lead me to conclude that I'm actually incredibly lucky. This change in perspective in the way that I view the situation surrounding my injury, all dependent upon being able to see the other side of the coin. And that is what perspective is all about.
Beautiful. We don't have a lot of time, but just briefly talk about the journey to the Paralympics and becoming a Paralympian champion, and what you drew on, what the experience was like, and actually competing in the Olympic Games.
It has been an immense honor to be a Paralympic athlete. I am reminded of my time in the SEAL teams, where it is so much training. Before you ever go and deploy, you're doing so much training that is unnoticed often. And that is the same life that an athlete lives, so much training, and it's discipline, it's commitment to the training. When I was injured and looking for the next step in my life, I was approached by a Paralympic liaison at Walter Reed Army Medical Center, where I was doing my physical therapy, learning how to walk. And I got into cross-country skiing. It was a chance to reconnect with nature. I loved trail running. I loved being in the woods. But more importantly, it was a chance to be part of a team, to follow a training plan, to see progress in my life. So important after being at that ground zero level, to regain a sense of my physicality, to work towards a goal, to push myself to physical and mental limits in training and in racing. And then, of course, to represent Team USA. That is such an honor. And this has been so important in my life, coming off of this injury, to be a part of Team USA.
Beautiful. Back to the other point about perspective. When doubt or fear does creep in, this is from Tim Henn in Atlanta, what do you do? What sources externally do you read? Do you listen to role models that give you kind of hope and inspiration for yourself? You're providing so much inspiration to ourselves, but where do you turn for inspiration?
Thank you, Tim. I appreciate that question. I remember reading the book by Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, and he talks about how there are multiple ways to find meaning. One is through work, one is through relationships and love, and the other is through confronting a difficult situation with bravery. I read that book during my days in the hospital. I was inspired by it. I have relied on many external sources, my friends, my family, representing the SEAL teams, not wanting to dishonor that community, wanting to face my injury with bravery. There were internal sources. That is just the way that I look at the situation, and that depended upon perspective. And then there's things like humor, joking about being taller than 6 feet tall, which I've tried, and I have to say it didn't quite work out. I'm naturally a 5'9" guy, but it's funny to joke about it, and so I think it was many sources really that I drew upon. Thank you for the question.
Some of our partners work with the Navy SEALs. Phil Johnston in the Bay Area does a lot of work with the Navy SEAL Foundation, and he's really trying to help on behalf of Spencer Stuart make the transition from the SEALs to enter the civilian workforce. How have you made that transition, or what advice do you have for us to help broader scale get these incredibly talented and motivational leaders into the workforce?
That's a great question. I think resilience and grit is in high demand. Now more than ever, it has become very evident that this is an important attribute that you want in your workforce, in your team. And you can start by asking people to tell their story, and to veterans across the board in the military often are very, very resilient people, and that is a wonderful attribute to have on your team, and asking them to tell you about some of the challenges they've had in their life and how they've responded. And it doesn't have to be veterans; it could be anyone that you're interviewing or working, assessing to see whether you want to work with them.
One of the things we take a lot of pride on at Spencer Stuart, Dan, is the ability to project potential. And a lot of times hiring managers hire square pegs for square holes. And so that'd be a really interesting thing to work on offline, how we can take that and try and translate that so that others can see the importance of what you're talking about. This is a very, very serious question. Much more serious than others. So you really don't like coffee. We get that. Talk about your morning routine. Are there daily routines that you do right from the get-go, the get up in the morning to get you going?
Well, I thanks for the question. I love to read the news. I do that, and then I eat breakfast, and I get out and I train. I think when you can create positive habits, that really helps with some things that are a little more difficult. Sometimes my training is really difficult. It's not easy to go do hard efforts out there, and I'm doing a lot of my training alone. Right now, things have just changed. So habit can be a really strong force, but it can also be a limiting factor in the sense that I realize I don't always control everything. And so trying to harness the strength of habit with also creating a more fluid, adaptable way to deal with contingencies. When I go to compete, we're jet lagged sometimes. Often, if it's in Europe, I'm not sleeping well for several days. And so knowing that I went the better part of a week without sleeping is something in Hell Week that I can rely upon or touch base upon it to help me get through difficult times. I think habit is a really strong force, but it can also be in some ways a limiting factor. So habit with fluidity and adaptability.
Eduardo Tobin, one of our colleagues, is asking a really nice question about your platoon. Have you stayed in touch with them? Have some kind of stayed connected and close? Did others get detached? And how have you worked on that?
Great question. The truth is I do not stay in touch with every member of the platoon. I do stay in touch very, very frequently with my assistant platoon commander. And the train goes on. I realized pretty quickly when you're injured, you can no longer be in the SEAL teams in the way that I had been in it. I could still stay in the community, definitely, but not under the terms which I have been working, which is that of an operational SEAL, where I have my legs and I'm on mission, so to speak, that I would then, if I stayed in, be in a more desk-bound capacity. So the train goes on. People, they get in, the members of my platoon formed up after that deployment, and they were in a new platoon, and then they just their careers kept going. And the number one thing I miss the most about my time in the military is the camaraderie. And I absolutely have stayed in touch with my fundamentally close friends, and it's really a source of strength and something I think is the number one thing, more than the mission, more than the training. It was the people that I got to work with. That is what meant the most to me, means the most to me.
Beautiful. I'm going to turn it over, Dan, to you in one moment. For a few final thoughts you wanted to share. I do want to make sure that a lot of people have texted and in the chat. A lot of us do have clients, friends out there who would love to benefit from Dan's experience, story, inspiration. And so through Tim McNary and our teams, we'll make sure that is available. And we want you, Dan, to be really busy and fully booked up with extremely lucrative client engagements that we want to help. I guess I'll summarize about a dozen comments in the chat with Travis Parsons, our great friend and partner in Silicon Valley, who said, Dan, you are unbelievable. You are a true hero and an inspiration to all of us. So thank you, and share a couple of final thoughts, and we so appreciate you being with us.
Thank you, Jim, and Dayton, thanks to you as well. Thank you, Spencer Stuart, and to the folks behind the scenes that are enabling this. And thanks to all of you for listening. Take the time out of your day to hear me talk. I just wanted to end with asking you a question, which is, how do you think you would react when you're pushed to your breaking point? Maybe some of you have been in a situation like this before, in which case you may know the answer to that question. Maybe some of you are in a situation like this right now during quarantine and sheltering in place. There have been these two main episodes that I've shared with you. There was the night under the log when I thought everything was falling apart. I learned that the best way to block out the long-term thoughts is to focus on the task at hand. It was the day that I woke up in the hospital, learned that my legs were gone, wondering whether I could ever find a sense of meaning again in life. Eventually, I learned about perspective, seeing the other side of the coin. To connect these two stories from my life to draw out the common theme, I think it's this. You often cannot control or even influence what happens to you, what happens to your team, but you absolutely can control how you respond. There will be bombs, so to speak, underground, waiting to go off, despite all the training, the preparation, the precautions you've taken. Sometimes these things just happen. You can't control them. But what you can control as a leader is how you respond. And in my experience, there's an amazing sense of power, freedom, and agency in recognizing that despite all of this uncertainty, chaos, so much that is out of our control, that you control your reaction, your attitude, your response every single time. It's yours. And I'll leave you with this. That bomb in Afghanistan took my legs. Can't change that. It was up to me to decide if it would take the rest of my life. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dan. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for you doing a great job connecting, Dan, to all of us.
Yeah.
So we'll sign off now. Again, we'll be back with the ability to share this. But thanks, and Dan, amazing.
Thanks, Jim.
All right, bye.